this would be a good time to pull out your ice caps, ski caps, and pull them over your head, or just leave the room. If you're okay with being streamed, stay in the room.
Is that the stream, Kim?
Or that. Or that.
I'm assuming that one's
All
not
of them.
gonna get- Well, there's one back there too. Okay, cool.
So, have you started the stream? So, to those of you not in the room, joining us online, we're just about to start the final session of the day, a roundtable on constructivism in an era of geopolitics, matching the overall theme of the conference. Now, the panelists have been given a set of questions, and my co-host, Morten, will tell you what they are.
Thank you, Halvard. So the idea with the roundtable is to have a slightly broader conversation about what it means to, let's say, practice and develop constructivist scholarship in what we somewhat imprecisely term an era of geopolitics. We have suggested some guiding questions to the panelists. For transparency, I'll go through them. How should constructivism engage with a new emphasis on geopolitics, great power competition, as is a popular term these days, war and security, and material power? Does this emphasis of our time challenge the credibility of constructivism, or does it reaffirm some of the central constructivist assumptions? Is constructivism some kind of an intellectual surplus phenomenon that we have time to engage in during calmer times in international politics? Does constructivism need to update its vocabulary? We've been talking about this as a philosophical position, but kind of practical when we talk about norms, identity, sovereignty, legitimacy. Are these terms, the operationalization of constructivism, is that something that we need to rethink today? Considering what could be called a liberal optimism of the 1990s, do we need some kind of more pessimistic form of constructivism today? And lastly, as we have been touching upon, how should constructivist scholars speak to policymakers, who often, is my impression, almost by instinct kind of falls back on more geopolitical materialist terms? So, Halvard?
To answer these questions, we've collected a roundtable of excellent scholars. In the order of the program, Rebecca Adler-Nissen from the University of Copenhagen, Kristin Haugevik from NUPI, Patrick Thaddeus Jackson from the American University, Oliver Kessler from the University of Erfurt, and Nicholas Onuf from Florida International University. It's a complete coincidence that I've co-written with three of them. And I've sat for a fourth. So we realized that trying to get these excellent scholars to keep time will be a challenge, but they've been given 5 minutes to give their initial thoughts on our questions or whatever else took their fancy. That will be followed by a discussion amongst the panelists, and then we will have a discussion involving the rest of you in the audience. There is no possibility of sending questions online. Without further ado, in the order of the program, Rebecca.
Thank you. So I took your questions very seriously, and will also try to give my 2 cents on this. And I want to locate the discussion about geopolitics, whatever that means, and constructivism, whatever that means, with a particular dimension of geopolitics today, which is what Ian Bremmer calls the technopolar order, which really is signaling at least that we are, when we talk about technology, AI race more precisely, that's a field for realism, or at least from material scholarships. That's something IPE, International Political Economy, should be well equipped at. But here comes the paradox. The more you spend time around AI scholars, the more you look and interview and spend time with Silicon Valley people, the more you realize it is not at all about the material, or rather, there are ontological and epistemological reasons why I think constructivism is not just very helpful, it's actually necessary. And, surprise, surprise, politicians value the constructivist interpretation of the AI race more than they value the realist or the materialist. And let me try to say why. Ontologically, when we talk about the AI race, we talk about stack, right? We talk about the Eurostack maybe. We talk about microchips and models and infrastructures, servers, data, and it all seems at first sight like no job for constructivists. This is about knowing something about atomic bombs or railroads. But as constructivist and historical IR and many others have shown, railroads are also both colonial and sovereign infrastructures. And the atomic bomb wasn't just the atomic bomb, it wasn't just a deterrent without mutually assured destruction and other such norms that evolve. It turns out with the AI race, it's even more, perhaps even more constructive. Because what much of Silicon Valley fusses around with, and Elon Musk talks about, are dreams or imaginaries of the future that doesn't even exist. So it's a world about going to colonize Mars or build super intelligence, whatever that might mean. And that raises the question of that stack, because do we then need to build AI factories all over the world? And what would it even mean to win that AI race? So we're still talking about what world we're moving in. It turns out it's not that easy. Is it, if the model performs better, is that winning the AI race? Is it to have more supercomputing power? Is that winning the AI race? Is it to have more of that rare earth? And all of that is being constructed and deconstructed, and frankly, no one knows. Not even those who say they do. So it's a big bloody mess. And then comes the epistemological layer, which with the AI race is fascinating and requires, I think, some kind of constructivist sensibility. Because what generative AI explains to us, in a sense, is that imitation and copying is real, that misinformation is partly constructive, partly something we have control over, something we lose control over. But it's certainly not something that is fully within the grasp of any of these people. So there's an epistemological question of truth and truth-making, to the sense that some would say the anti-essentialists win all the way down. Because there will, in a few seconds, be no ability for us to know where we are. In a sense, the chatbot has replaced the internet, which means that it's a question of data, models, and the impossibility of knowing how we came up with a certain truth, which is part of the Gen problem. So the AI race turns out to be ontologically, epistemologically, and maybe also normatively deeply contested and constructed. But it also tells us the importance of trying then to take a step back and try to find out where the authoritarian, fascist, gendered, racist, classed, but also liberal tenets of these anti-woke or liberal ideas of trying to make truths in this world. What I'm trying to say is that I think constructivism or constructivist sensibilities can highlight what makes the AI race both familiar to us, to anyone who's been following any of the technological races, but also what makes it unique. So in short, when we talk about geopolitics, in this field at least, the AI race turns out to be much less a competition of machines than a competition of meanings. And it is those meanings, freedom, harmony, sovereignty, safety, that will shape, partly at least, the future of world order.
Thank you very much. Kristin?
Yes. Okay, I'll use 10 of my seconds to just say how thrilled I am to see everyone here in Oslo, and also how proud I am of my NUPI colleagues who have organized this. I think it's a fantastic conversation that we're having. So thank you everyone for your efforts. It's been a lovely conversation so far, and it's also been an important conversation. So I'm very happy that we're having that in Oslo and at NUPI. So why am I on this roundtable besides being the NUPI alibi alongside our two moderators? For one, I do not consider myself a theorist in the purest sense of the word. I rarely develop theory or use theory or work with theory for its own sake, but I like theory, and I always draw on theory, and I use theory, and I reflect critically on theory. And I think some element of theory is always necessary to what we do, and also at a research institute like NUPI. And I think that's the perspective I can offer on this panel here today, and I'll come back to that. I did most of my training at the University of Oslo in the early 2000s, and there weren't too many constructivists around. So my interest and gradual preference for constructivist theory, that kind of came on the way. I think it began when I was doing my master thesis. I did a course with Jeffrey Jekyll, who was one of the few constructivists at that university. And then at the same time, I also began working at NUPI, where I obviously found a crowd for discussing these types of questions. And quite quickly, I began to realize that there was a whole other world of scholarship that I needed to familiarize myself with, and which also resonated very well with the kind of scholarly instincts that I myself had on the importance of social relations, on the importance of language, and on the importance of storytelling. So for me, constructivist thinking became a bit of a game changer and a door opener. And it made me realize that political science wasn't this ready-made profession study where you just needed to learn the rules and then apply them. But actually the discipline was much wider, and there was many more possibilities for exploring the kind of things that I was actually very interested in and deeply concerned about. So to me, constructivism is less of a theory to be applied than it is an approach and way of seeing the world. I think one possible methodology, maybe you would call it, Patrick. And you have explained this difference very well in one of your best-selling books. You, I think, suggest that post-structuralism and constructivism agree on mind-world monism, but they differ on transfactualism, and what we can and cannot know about, in principle, non-observables. And this is, I think, my main struggle with constructivism, because I position myself somewhere in between that. I think, theoretically speaking, I think I would agree that we cannot acquire knowledge about real-life mechanisms behind, discourse and observable practices. But I think when we are, especially at a place like this, especially at a place like NUPI, when we are confronted with real-life problems, if we can call them that, then we are sometimes pushed on that question. And I think the element of transfactualism is what tends to become blurred for us. Now, I study social relations, and I especially study amicable social relations. This is kind of what I have been doing for many years. And I'm interested in how ideas and practices of cooperation and friendship are constructed, how they are maintained, how they are abandoned. And I'm also interested in, for example, how states' foreign policy identities shape their repertoires and their responses in relation to others. And I like to look at patterns in discourse in the types of narratives that are constructed about ourselves and about our relationship with others. And I'm interested in the power of the construction itself. So not necessarily whether something exists or not, or is there a special relationship between the United States and the UK? To me, the interesting question is not yes or no. It's how the representation of that relationship is being carried out in everyday discourse and practice. So how then, to return to one of your questions, should constructivism engage with a new emphasis on geopolitics, great power competition, war, security, and material power? And when you work at a research institute like NUPI, you tend to have feet in several camps. We do basic research here, but we also do policy work. We do theory and we do empirics. We do short-term and we do long-term. And I have many times, as a NUPI researcher, been advised to take those theory perspectives out, because practitioners, aren't too interested in that. I think it goes to your point, Rebecca. And I've been told that that's something, we as researchers are interested in, forums like this. But I think that would be unwise to remove that and think of that as separate things. While some occasions allow better for theorization, I think theory perspectives and analytical models, that is something we as researchers can offer, and it's something we can offer to the policy world. And I think unlike journalists and consultants and diplomats, we can actually afford to point out a theory-informed approach. And I think more often than we think that this is something also our non-academic audiences appreciated, which is exactly your point as well. I think the constructivist thinking is maybe not so strange when we move around in those worlds, because they're not part of these turf wars. So while it's not always emphasized and explicitly foregrounded, I think it's part of why I really like working here, is that we're allowed to flip-flop between those two worlds, and we're allowed to use one to inform the other, and I really like that. And I think constructivism helps me do that, because one can be, I think, both constructivist or post-structuralist or whatever we would call it at heart, but you can still use those approaches to analyze what we may call real-life problems or world problems or whatever term we could use. And it goes to the heart of what critical constructivism is about. It's about finding out how truths are constructed, how meaning is acquired, how power can be constituted and then taken away again. And I think it challenges us to think critically about why we use the terms that we use, why we tell the stories that we tell in the way that we tell them, how something rather than something else became the dominant objects of analysis or categories of analysis or categories of practice. So at a time where our ability to critically judge what is true, what is accurate, and what is reasonable, at a time when that is increasingly put under pressure, I think constructivism is not only a tool that tells us that any truth is as good as another, but it is a tool to understand precisely how that process comes into being. And I think that is actually what is the value of that perspective. Okay.
Thank you very much. Patrick.
Well, me. Cool.
That's you, yeah.
That's me. Excellent. No, that's great. That's great. Just to dispense with this at the beginning, I have very little interest in talking to policymakers, largely because the policymakers do use a set of terms and discourses and ways of sense-making in the world that make it very difficult to get a word in that isn't sort of dealing with their specific vocabulary. That said, I can explain why that is the case because of my linguistic constructivist understandings of things. I understand why they have the kind of world that they have. And frankly, even though I'm not particularly interested in talking to the policymakers, I'm very interested in teaching the people who will grow up to be policymakers, and we get a whole lot of them at the university. One of the primary reasons why students come to my university, which is in Washington, D.C., is because they want to work in the D.C. machine. And I consider it part of my vocation to sow as much sand in the gears of that machine as I can by getting students who are already coming in with a kind of fairly naive realist/liberal way of thinking about national interest to go, wait a minute, maybe this is more complicated than we think it is. And so if I can get them to that point, game over. I feel like I've done my job at that point, right? They're stopping to think a little bit. Cool, okay, end of conversation. And I think in many ways that's the most kind of implication and most sort of effect of the kind of teaching that I do will have. I'm trying to be sort of not overly optimistic about exactly how much that's going to change. But I do think that there's room that way. The point, I think, is that it is the language of policymakers that is the problem in many cases. And our job, if we don't like that language, is to work on ways of changing that language, which is a slow, long process. All right, so turning from that world into some of the other questions for a second here. I want to question the framing of several of the questions. on the idea that seems to be kind of implicit in those questions, that a theory has to somehow correspond to a phenomenon in order to say something meaningful about it. I'm going to call bullshit. No, I don't actually think that's the case. We have this tendency, because of our neo-positivist hangover, to conflate theory and description, as though describing the world in terms of its rising prevalence of geopolitics had some kind of theoretical implications. It does not. The descriptive claim, there's more geopolitics going on, there's more hard power being deployed, is a fact that can be explained in a variety of different ways. I would further argue that unless you take things like meaning, culture, and discourse seriously, you will never understand why there is an increased prevalence of those things now compared to years past. Why the forms that state-sponsored violence takes are different now than they were previously. Why things rise and fall. Why borders are negotiated in the way that they are. The fact, the descriptive fact, does not actually tell you anything. So rather than is constructivism, whatever that is, and I'll get to that in a second, relevant in an era of increased geopolitics and increased power political competition, I would say it's just as relevant now as it always was. Because phenomena do not tell you how to theorize them, right? That's just not the way that works. Now, theory, and I started to talk about this a little bit on the previous panel, right? When we scholars, and I'm going to associate with that group for a second, use theory, right? Theory is scientific ontology. Theory is a component of an explanatory exercise of some sort. We take our broad sensibilities and we turn them into analytical equipment that we can use to explain things. Yes, so we've instantiated broader commitments when we do this, including political, ethical, and I'd even say theological commitments that get sort of built into our broad worldviews. But those commitments themselves are, I think, analytically distinct from what we do when we produce theory out of them, right? Which is sort of a refined set of scientific ontologies, a refined set of claims that we can then use to help explain things. And I think that refining process is precisely what makes it possible for scholarship to be anything other than partisan political stand-taking, which A, is what I think Weber's actually getting at in the Politikwissenschaft distinction to begin with, and B, what I actually also think that Dewey was saying. Jason and I read Dewey slightly differently on this point, but that's okay. Dewey's complicated, and he lived till he was 90-something, and he wrote a bajillion things. He's not always consistent. But the idea that there is a value, call it political if you want to, I don't want to argue about the word, there's a value to stepping out of the stream of contestation to actually refine intellectual tools that you can use to explain something. And I think that value of refining, that value of stepping back is one of the core things that animates like the academy as an institution. And that's one of those things that we have to protect, particularly now in, my country where
say no more.
Yeah. Well, this is being live cast, so I can't say more. I'd like to go home at some point. We shall see. We shall see. And parenthetically, you asked, one of the questions that you asked was about sort of what do we mean by pessimistic constructivism. A long time ago, Dan Nexon and I wrote this piece on realist constructivism, in which we argued that if you take the underlying sensibility about the inescapability of power conflict, then there's no reason that needs to be incompatible with a constructivist emphasis on ideas and discourse. In fact, there were these guys named Foucault and Nietzsche who were really big on power contestation, and so that should be part of the pathway that we talk about. In deference to the time commitment here, I'm not going to put the 2x2 up, which is actually, so I have it later, I can show it to people. But I think there's a way you can differentiate within, which leads me into my second point, which is constructivism as a term is just so big and broad and impossible for me at least to work with. I don't know what it means to say a constructivist position on something, because there's just so many different kinds of things that go on within this. Not only do you have all these different sorts of claims, we have this central conflation, I think, that you get in any of these IR-isms that we like to map the field with, which is that we conflate and confuse theory, methodology, and method as if they were all the same thing. And I don't know that that makes a lot of sense, because within this big thing called constructivism, or people who self-identify as constructivists, you've got a variety of methodological options ranging from neo-positivist hypothesis testing down to critical reflexivity and the performance of fictional narratives, right, and everything in between, right? A whole bunch of stuff going on in there. Theories, people sometimes say norms go with it. I don't think I've ever written in a positive sense in anything I've written the word norm. Like, I don't work with norms. Like, that's not a thing I do.
Normative.
Normative, perhaps, but not norms as a noun, particularly the kind that can turn into an independent variable that get tested against, other kinds of factors to see what explains behavior. So I think there's a wide range of things sort of going on there theoretically. And method-wise, right? You got some self-identified constructivists who basically do comparative case studies, and you've got some who now do like quantitative text analysis to map discourse and discursive deployment, and you've got everything else you can possibly imagine fitting in there. So it's just really big, and I think if we actually want to break this down, we actually have to separate out these threads, the methodological, the method, and the theory, and actually think in those categories rather than trying to think in realism, liberalism, constructivism, particularly because, and I alluded to this before, constructivism as an operative label in the American Academy emerges as a not realism and liberalism. So everybody else gets sort of thrown into that particular box. So I want to sort of call our attention to that. There's a lot of kind of diversity there, and we need to kind of respect that. Am I a constructivist? I mean, for myself, I prefer theories that foreground embedded social action and the making of meaning. The methods I like involve the reconstruction of meanings and intentions, and methodologically, I prefer configurational explanations to simple variable-based nomothetic hypotheses. And I like ideal types. Am I a constructivist? I don't know. You tell me.
So far, the first two speakers have refuted our claim that politicians and policymakers tend to frame international politics in geopolitical materialist terms, and Patrick has reacted strongly against the question of whether constructivism makes sense of the world today, or can make more or less sense in a geopolitical world. I think it's fair to say that they've risen to take our bait, Morten. Thank you very much. I am sure the next two will also do the same thing. Oliver Kessler.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing. Thank you for putting us these easy questions. And what you do when you don't have an answer, you twist and turn them a bit. So when I read the answer, I thought, what's the unity of difference? Where do the questions come from? And of course, everybody has the feeling that the world is falling apart and it's the end of the world. Maybe it is. Well, it sounded like that constructivism is a thing of the 90s. It's something nice to have. A momentary lapse of reason. A byproduct of the liberal aspirations of the 90s, so that we now face the brutal reality of world politics. We are refuted and have to go back and be ashamed of ourselves. Well, so the first question then comes to mind is that does constructivism come necessarily with a progressivist politics? As a constructivist, do I need to believe in normative progress? No. As when you know my PhD supervisor, you can be as pessimistic and miserable as a constructivist as any other person in the world. So it doesn't make you a necessarily optimistic person who enjoys dancing around the fires and holding hands or something. It doesn't need to be that way. Of course, and shall we say, did the 90s have an impact? So, does it come with the politics? No. Did the 90s have an impact on how constructivism emerged that we need to revisit? Most definitely. And I can say, let me get to that for a minute. But when you start with early constructivism, there was an interest, even in the, not talk about Ashley and Rob Walker, who should be also highly mentioned here. But there was an interest in Speech Act. Even Wendt's original position, or take his alien as we have it this morning. There was an interest in understanding the other. There's a self-other distinction at the core of what constructivism constitutes. It's not just a bundle of individuals or a bunch of same actors, because then you can have wonderful game theory without being, where you have several actors who act in a similar way, without being ever a constructivist. And then you, of course, I mean, if you go down that route and say, well, what kind of equilibrium is being played? Is then like a social That's not the point, is it? I mean, it's about coming to terms with fundamental differences where ego and alter have to make themselves understood and have to understand the contingencies of their own relations in expectations to the other, and understand that the expectations that they form feed back on their own positions, so that the positions that they take are not something immortally valid given. It's not just a piece of jazz. It's a condensed form of expectations that form constant and are constantly changing. Otherwise, there would not be any divorce in the world. You know, I mean, if relations wouldn't change and expectations wouldn't change, I mean, people would stick together for the rest of their lives. Thank you so much for identities. But I'm still married. So, that got, in the 90s, not sure whether my wife hears that, so please, I mean. In the 90s, if you look at the world state is inevitable, if you look at norm cycle, if you look at, there's also the spiral model, for example, heavily progressive to the bones, to the core, but at the same time, they lost the very, for me, essential ingredient, and I would say essential, or at least a key problematique about how to actually bridge the gap between ego and alter and stabilize expectations in a way that we can actually create meaning, form expectations, and go on, and actually do communicate. World norms, norm cycle turned norms into something objective that states could now decide to adhere to or violate, as if it was a thing. I mean, I can decide whether I want to go through that door or not. Thank you very much. I mean, so also so at the same time, all the 90s, I mean, look at I did this for a minute, like a survey of introductory chapter to constructivism. What were the key two terms that they mentioned? Norms and agent structures. There is not a single chapter that does not mention agent structure. Agent structure for me is the absence of constructivism, because it's agent structure, not agents structure. It loses the plural. And then you have that, it's not about, how agents try to make sense and then create stability and then creates institutions that then feed back on the kind of positionalities that you can take, but not take at the same time, because not everything is possible. So it loses that, and then it became all about supervenience or anything else, which is not, for me, I mean, it's a philosophy of mind problem. It's not a constructivist problem. So did it not come with critique? Of course. I feel like I've written 20 years about it. That this is not about, this is fundamentally not constructivist theorizing. Did I win? Did I did I convince anybody? No. The critique wouldn't stick, because the 90s were so progressive that, the key question is about how robust the norm is, and whether you can empirically find conditions under which norm robustness is actually valid, or how contestation of norms actually support robustness of norms, or whether they then fade away, which is interesting for some people, not the core. Shall we say, what gets confused is that norms provide one answer to the problem of the ego-alter problem, but they're not the solution. They're not the problem, they're a solution to a question that is prior to that. And what got lost is that prior question about ego-alter. Everybody focused on norms and was happy with that, and now you see gazillions of constructivists telling me, how many hours did I spend on not social media person, but trying to contest the idea that constructivism is about norms. And the norms, study of norms is constructivism, and therefore everybody who mentions norms is a constructivist by definition. Did I say that constructivists can be miserable persons? Yeah. So, 2 minutes. Are there lessons? So yes, if you take constructivism as norms, then you're lost. If you focus again to the question of ego and alter, then the geoeconomics world is actually, let's say, not a major problem to constructivists, because, I mean, it would actually maybe help us to refocus on some of the key questions, because over the course of the last 20 years, we developed a wonderful, elaborate vocabulary about how relations are formed and how identities are formed, and everything is about integration and everything is about stability. Well, we have not developed a similar nuanced vocabulary of disruptions and disintegrations. And in particular, we have not developed a social theory which would take integration and disintegration in symmetrical ways, or where things. So I would say there is something to be learned. There's something that we can develop further, especially as we then can actually also understand, and this is my take then, if we take the ego alter problem as seriously as I would like to, and see language, discourses and concepts and the symbolic orders, or however you want to call it, as a way that through which stabilities, positions, fields are stabilized, then you can try to understand how this is continuously changing and what kind of knowledge regime, I would say, or infrastructure of critique is actually now being created. Who are the experts? Who is entitled to speak of the new geoeconomic world? What kind of knowledge is activated? What kind of concepts get activated actually in making sense of what's going on? And who is entitled to speak of that world and who is not entitled to speak of the world? Who feels disempowered? What gets silenced? Who gets excluded? It's similar then the key questions of what we want to ask and understand, because not everybody feels entitled to speak in the same way. I mean, if we enter the language of, and this is where I'm coming from, if we enter the language of economics and like market relations, and if we enter the vocabulary of global economy, well, my parents feel very disempowered to speak about it. They would have opinions about it, but they would never able to say that they could actually entitle to something like a public space where they can have meaningful deliberations, because they feel excluded and silenced, because they don't have the vocabulary to actually formulate their ideas in a manner that would make sense to economists, that they would take it seriously. So there is this epistemic hierarchy, and there is this exclusion, and there are the silences. And I mean, just because we're now moving from one to the other doesn't make that go away. So I think our problem remains. Thank you.
This is riveting television, ladies and gentlemen. The last speaker will surely not disappoint us either. Nick, take us home.
Thank you. Thank you all for organizing this splendid affair. When I'm tempted, of course, to comment on Oliver's commentary, but I won't, because I actually have something else I want to talk about, having been inspired by the organizers' questions. When I hear the term geopolitics, I think 1870, 1880, 1890, 1898. And I think, oh, geopolitics and what else? Vulgar materialism. It's vulgar materialism in the most egregious way. We should never forget that. As someone pointed out, I think Stefano pointed out to me earlier today, it gives rise to fascism. That kind of ontological extremism gives rise to fascism. All right, so what did our counterparts 150 years ago do in the face of this vulgar materialism, which of course the Marxists also were concerned about? They invented social Darwinism. Ah, nice. Consider it. They get legitimacy, a pedigree, intellectual credibility by invoking Darwin. What? How many years after The Origin of Species is published, when it's no longer highly controversial in intellectual circles and in the academic world? It works beautifully to cancel out the vulgarity of materialism as expressed in the geopolitical literature of the time. Now, we all know this, but I don't think any of us have spent any time wondering if there's something analogous happening at the current moment, where we have the reassertion of a vulgar materialism. When you were talking about artificial intelligence, wow, what could be more vulgar than that? Intellectually speaking, right? This is the flat-out vulgarity of ontology in the hands of people who should never have been listened to by anybody. So what is happening out there in the world that offsets that vulgarity of the materialism at the moment? I'm not talking about Bruno Latour's neo-materialism, even though I think it's a crock. He's not that vulgar. He's pretty close, but he's not that vulgar. What have we invented that corresponds to social Darwinism to offset the vulgar materialism of the moment that gives rise to this geopolitical fantasia that we're engaged in? It's social construction. That's our new version of it. Yeah, think about it. Think about the power of the metaphor to make, to construct. Oh, you hit the right, you get the forward momentum. Think of it as a gerund, making, constructing. There's a lot of discursive momentum in the very choice of the gerund for those verbs. Making America great again. Wow. It works. It's powerful. Just the way social Darwinism and its racist, especially its racist versions, were powerful. It strikes a folk sensibility. During the break, I was persuaded that what I was trying to talk about in the constructivist sensibility is a folk sensibility, a folk constructivism, which is grounded in this notion that we can make anything happen we want to. We can go back and recreate a bigger and better world. We can purge all the immigrants by a certain amount of linguistic legerdemain. It's all it takes. Now, what can we do about this? I'm not sure that we can do anything about it, because language is more powerful than we are. And we, of course, want to be responsible in our use of our terms to make sure that when I use the word ideology, everybody knows what I'm talking about. Come on, guys, give me a break. We know what ideology is. We know what happens when it gets in the hands of the wrong people. We know what a folk ideology is. And I think we all know that constructivism has generated a folk ideology of extraordinary danger and destructive potential in our time. I'm finished.
I don't know where to go after that. I do know where to go after that, because the moderators have used modern technology and decided to go back to a topic from the early morning, go to a topic of chronopolitics. We're imposing our chronopolitical power to say that the planned chat between the panelists will have to be suspended because they took a little more time than we had suggested.
This is a surprise.
This
You
is
put the five of us up here and you give us a platform?
So we'll go directly to the audience. If you need a little time to ponder questions, I'm pretty sure the panelists can step in for a while. But otherwise, we're happy to take questions, comments disguised as questions, or straight up comments.
Can I make-
Yes. Well,
No, go ahead. Please, let
Casper from NUPI.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. I'd like to think about this as a kind of a therapeutical session, if this is okay with you. I was thinking about what Rebecca started out with, saying that politicians naturally and kind of intuitively buy constructivist arguments. And I think this is very true. So if somebody asks you why has, I don't know, Germany not militarized before until very recently, or why Russia has attacked Ukraine, if you're able to give an answer which is rooted in historical arguments about narratives, discourses, identities perhaps, you don't have to use, or you shouldn't use those words, but you should actually argue from those positions, then you're likely to be given a platform, and politicians are going to probably be listening to you. And they're also likely to use similar explanations. Now, is that good news for constructivism? I don't think so. I think that actually the appeal of structural theories like neorealism or horrible things like classical geopolitics is the way they're counterintuitive and are able to present themselves as objective and scientific. And it's much more difficult for constructivism, and I think, unfortunately, that constructivist scholarship has failed because if it was trying to be this kind of, quasi-scientific enterprise, it was going in the direction that Oliver was describing, norms as variables, which is also not very helpful because it's also gibberish, unfortunately, in many ways. And I think one of the problems is that in the 1990s, but also afterwards, a lot of constructivist scholarship was not able to consciously understand its own positionality and consciously understand its own, the way it was nested and enmeshed in the politics of the given era. So the politics it was arguing from. It was kind of going native with the political environment, also because the politicians were so eager to actually accept those arguments. So I don't really know, how do we get out of this situation? Because if constructivism is really hijacked by this kind of folk theorizing, then how can we work towards a constructivism that is at the same time more clearly distinct from this and not hijacked by kind of quasi-scientification? I don't know, sorry, lack of a word, but I think you know what I mean.
Kristin, you signaled you wanted to respond to that. Patrick would
We
also
can
like.
take more questions if.
No, I had no hands immediately up, and you were the first one.
Yes, okay. No, I think that's a great question, Casper. But I was just, in response to you, wondering about whether this is unique to constructivist theory, or whether, this would be a problem for any theory, that you would have analytical and practical categories that become blurred, because you have practitioners who start using those terms that we have sort of tried to take hold of in theory, norms, ideas, identities, and they somehow resonate with general public, and then they tend to live their own lives, right? So we need to keep that, I think, as analysts, we need to keep that apart, and then I think that's where sort of the analysis of narratives and storytelling comes in, because it allows us to actually identify what is what. And in a sense, we are part of that same storytelling too, because we don't only use analytical categories, we also use practical categories, right, in our terms. And I think that's what sometimes gets blurry. And I was saying, I'm sometimes not quite clear about this either, because we are constantly reacting to world problems, and then you don't always have the time to take that step back and consider what's what.
Patrick also wanted to chip in.
Yeah. not a disagreement, 2 footnotes. First of all, not Nick and Fritz and John Ruggie as sort of early constructivists, but all of the sort of next folks, like the 1.5 generation folks, they in the American Academy, right? We're talking about Finnemore and Barnett and Audie Klotz and those sorts of folks. All of them came to academic scholarship with a set of normative political agendas that they wanted to advance. These are largely folks who came out of peace activism and disarmament work, and folks who came to the academy with a set of normative goals. The compromise that they then made to get those goals on the research agenda was the methodological compromise. So we're not going to push methodology. We're not going to push disagreement with the underlying neo-positivism of American IR. Instead, we're going to slip right on in there and get those social theoretical notions translated into terms that the neo-realists and neoliberals would sort of be able to understand and engage with. That's why every single one of those articles from the mid to late 90s has a weird split personality. There's a first half, which is all this thick social theoretical stuff. And then there's, I selected these cases in order to get variation on these variables so that I could test and see whether there was an approach. They all do it. And that was, from what I've garnered in talking to many of them, deliberate. They're like, we're not going to fight that battle. We're going to fight this other battle. We're going to get these other things onto the agenda. So I think there's a deliberateness to that history there. Second, something we haven't talked about, though Oliver started to touch on it a little bit. I would approach it differently than with the language of agent structure. I would approach it with the question of the constitution of actorhood and actors as actors, which is another way of sort of saying the same kind of thing. So the big underlying thing that I think animates a lot of the language that many people who self-identify as constructivists are opposed to is not materialism, but individualism. Rank, instrumentalist individualism. And what a lot of us are interested in, whether it's agent structure, co-constitution, or authorization, legitimation, formation of actors and subjectivities, whatever, we're all not starting from the position of pre-social individuals doing stuff, right? That formulation that Wendt has in, I think it shows up before it shows up in the 99 book, but it's in the 99 book, that whole desire plus belief equals action thing, you know, that most of us are not on board with that, because that's not what we do. We're not interested in like saying, oh, how people believe and what their interests are explains their outcomes. It's like, no, that's not what we want to do here, because we're not starting with the idea that there are these pre-constituted individuals floating around having interests in believing stuff and like bouncing off of one another. The problem is that assumption, to use Nick's term, the folk kind of sensibility behind that, I mean, that's freaking liberalism. I mean, that's like philosophical liberalism. That's been going on for hundreds of years. It's really hard to dislodge. So yeah, you can make some inroads with policymakers by saying, well, Russia did this because of the beliefs that their foreign policymakers held, but what did you do to do that? You've adopted the metaphysic of autonomous individuals believing stuff and therefore doing things. So I would argue, and I'm pessimistic about our chances, that the only way you really get away from this is you shift that language. And Dewey spent 50 years of his career trying to shift that language by introducing notions of transactionalism. And people are using the term relations to try to dislodge that. That's a long fight. And it's mostly a catalog of losses, right? We haven't budged that particular needle very far.
Yeah, I have 3 people on my list, Isabel, Yusuf, and Yuha.
But Rebecca also wanted to say.
Can I go first, or?
Two things. One, there's nothing inherently progressive theoretically. I think we agree on that. In fact, I think there's something inherently dark in constructivism that I really like, which is the stream of constructivism. I think we've narrowed constructivism a bit too much in our sort of self-flagellating. I mean, the history of constructivism broadly, as a very broad tent, also, in my mind, includes a lot of people who now become labeled as post-structuralists, and some of them are sitting in the room. And they didn't really, there wasn't a distinction, right? So you also got the Bartelsson, you got the Cynthia Weber, all that, which is more about what is constituted as normal rather than what norms are. And all that stream still exists, and lots of good research is still being produced, which exactly shows the power politics and the brute forces, inequalities, whatever you might, the silences that you need in order for something to become normal or something to become hegemonic, for lack of a better word. So I think there's a lot of great research to still go back to again. And that brings me to your question about is good news for constructivism that constructivists' explanations of foreign policy, like Russia, like Nora's earlier this morning, her explanation, if you were, for Russian imperialism, it's deeply constructivist. Is it bad news that our policymakers might understand it? I think it's good news, because then you can at least say it's complicated. There's nothing like the Mersheimer's crap is. I mean, if that's one thing, right? They will clearly understand that there's no such thing as an interest, as spheres of interest, as something objective, and it does give you a little bit of room to make life more complicated, to throw sand into the machine. So I think it's very good news, and I think we should just be much more bold.
Social media generation reflects on constructivism. It's complicated.
And be bold.
As well.
Yeah, thanks a lot. For the panel, and also for this theoretical potential, and to like hire this potential. I'd like you to speak a bit more to territory, and because at least for my own sake, that has been for example, with Trump's interest in Greenland. I'm Danish, then I've had to look at a globe and being okay, well, actually suddenly materiality in the sense of territory, for myself at least, gets a new meaning. Okay, I see why he considered it a sphere of interest. I don't see why he needs to own it, but that's another thing. But so just, I don't know, I'm not sure how to put this really, but I just wanted to, because Rebecca, I really loved the way you spoke about AI and sort of that materiality, but the rest of you sort of, deconstructed constructivism, or, but can you speak to the, maybe even more to the materiality and the territory, in the sense of these new logics that, at least, whether we like it or not, the whole idea of sphere of interest is more, at least some would say that Trump would like to divide the world into three, and then you have or at least it seems like they play more, the world leaders play more, geopolitics as they did in the 1800s, but then with adding on to that AI and social media and the whole construction of, let's say, Donald Trump Jr. in Greenland, his whole selling, I don't know, trying to sell the US to Greenland was a form of constructivism as well. But then the whole, I'd like you to touch a bit more on this territorial questions. Yeah.
For those watching at home, she did say selling the US to Greenland. I think she meant the opposite. So Yusuf, and then you and Jason, then we'll return back.
Thank you very much for this panel. My question is to Professor John Jackson, because you once again mentioned this dichotomy between this, politik and Wissenschaft, which is kind of interesting, because I'm to the US, we're in the northern neighborhood, and we're in Canada, we're not really there's no distinction in this between these two ends, I would say. I really wonder how does it look like in practice to step outside of politics and concentrate on Wissenschaft, because there's this major literature, especially critical constructivism as well, who's arguing against the ability to step outside, right? We are always in one or the other ladder in power relations, right? I was wondering how does it look like even in academia, because even you mentioned that I don't want to talk about my country because I want to be able to go back, right? So then we're in one shape or form in a ladder of some type of power relation, right? I just wanted to.
Yeah, and if Isabel gets her way, he'll be going back to Greenland, right?
I might prefer to go back to Greenland.
Juha.
Yeah, I'd like to push back. It's a great panel, but to Nick push back a bit on the newness of constructivism as a folk power of folk theory explaining current geopolitics. Because of course, constructivism and forward momentum, that was part of the Soviet avant-garde in the early 20th century, creating a whole art movement of idealist communism, which of course then was perverted and transformed later on. But as Václav Havel talked about, all of the socialist republics, they had to live the lie. They were forced to live the lie that was given up, constructed at the top, and everybody had to do that. And when people no longer believed that they had to live the lie, that's when the whole system collapsed. In the U.S., it was pursuit of life, liberty, and the right to pursue your personal lie. But now in today's communication environment, they are living a different lie that I want to live, and that is the conflict. And then you have these people who have a new forward momentum. We can make our lie the lie everyone has to live. So is that maybe more of the dynamic, a new revolution?
I don't consider your remarks a pushback at all. I think they are a plausible expansion of my general point.
Last comment from the audience before you give the word back to the panel.
Well, yeah, thank you. I guess I'm wondering about this word theory and suggesting a broader understanding of it. When we think of the origin of the ideas that have changed history. Okay, we're interested in historical change as constructivists, but if you look at the origins of those ideas that have changed history, I don't think they come from IR, right? I think they come from political theory, right? And this, I wonder if this is what policymakers want. Do policymakers want explanations, or do policymakers want theories of justice that will make them the leader of revolutionary change? And if those politicians who want to be politicians that change the world, where do they get their ideas from? They don't get it from IR. They get it from political theories of justice. Now, we can argue about what those justice claims are, right? It might be a fascist theorist, it might be a democratic theorist, but I wonder, what IR theorist has changed the world? Broad question. And do we need to talk more to political theorists?
Who wants to go first? Patrick, you were facing a direct question.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Your first name?
Yusuf.
So it's a great question. What is it what is this sort of Politikwissenschaft thing kind of look like in practice? I mean, and again, I want to be clear about the claim, right? To say that there is an operative distinction between the realms of Politik and the realm of Wissenschaft is not to say that people aren't enmeshed in power relations. That's not the claim. The claim is that it is possible to carve out a space in which a different kind of logic would reign, rather than the logic of pure power competition. Within the academy, if I suppress someone's publications because I don't like them, that is generally considered to be an illegitimate move. If I'm in the sphere of politics and I suppress someone's comments because I don't like them, that's considered good politics. Right? I'm stopping them from having the word, right? So there are different rules of the road that are sort of constituted within these different kinds of realms. What does it know? They're not norms because they aren't solid objects. They're like common places that people can draw on in various ways to produce things. What does it look like in practice? It looks like me teaching in Washington, D.C., and steadfastly refusing every effort by any agency downtown to have me come in and advise them about what sort of policies the United States should be putting forth. Because I don't feel like that's my job, and I don't feel like I have enough knowledge of any particular issue area that I could weigh in on that with some kind of expert authority. The other part of my job, as I had alluded to before, is making sure that my students don't walk out the door with the idea that somehow they are now, by virtue of their degree in international relations or international studies, that they are somehow now empowered to go in and say, oh, well, the U.S. should be doing this or the U.S. should be doing that. No, you're freaking not. No, you're not. Stop, think, move back a little bit, right? I often will compare what we do at the university, what I attempt to do at the university, using the kind of administrative authority that I have been sort of forced to take on at various times during my career, to create spaces in which we can take people who are sort of thinking along the lines of policy recommendations and pull them in and say, hang on a second, let's unpack those terms that you're using. Let's unpack the assumptions that are kind of underneath there. In a sense, let's engage in the pedagogy of making you recognize that that sensibility that you're operating with, if we turn it into a logically consistent theory, leads you places you don't want to go. And therefore, maybe you shouldn't do that. Not because the theory's true, but because you already are operating with a sensibility and you aren't actually aware of what that is until you come in and we start going, what's behind that word? What do you mean by that? Tell me more about that logic. So in a way, we're like basically running seminars, like good pedagogical seminars to encourage people to start reflecting on things. Sure, there might be some way in which one could say, I do that in part because of an underlying social theoretical sensibility about construction. Okay, maybe, but that's not the point. The point is that there's nothing in the content of constructivist theory or any of my theories that I could use as a club to go and beat some policymaker over the head with and say, you should do the following thing. That's the part of the link, which is a very strong link in a place like DC, that I consider it part of my vocation to break apart. And a very effective way of breaking that apart is to keep insisting on the distinction between Politik and Wissenschaft as ideal-typically separated realms, and to work to try to maintain that set of distinctions. Can I say one thing about materialism? Territory is not material. I'll just say that. Territory is not material. So everything you just said is entirely commensurate with an emphasis on meaning-making and social process.
Well, if you go around talking about Politik and Wissenschaft in Washington, D.C., I can see why no one wants to talk to you. Stefano wanted to do your introduction.
Just about this, is it not possible to be bilingual?
I have colleagues who are. I'm terrible at languages. I always have been. It took me years to be able to get a reading competence in German, right? And that's it. I have no interest in any, because I can't make heads or tails of any other sort of language. I'm a pretty monolingual kind of person. Weber himself was not. Weber himself was able to move back and forth between a variety of different domains.
And he wrote badly in all.
And he wrote badly in all of them because, you know, he learned his 19th century German grammar very well. But no, I mean, I have colleagues. Dan Nexon and I have written many, many things together over the years. Dan is much more bilingual than I am. Dan can speak policy language. I can't. I hear 30 seconds of it and I go, wait a minute, hold on, that's not logically consistent. What are you doing there? What's that leap you just made? How's that piece going right there? So this is why I don't get invited back to the symposia on the future of NATO in the United States, because I show up and say things like, hang on, what do you mean by civilization exactly? And like, which version of this are you talking about? Let's not even get started on geopolitics, right? I mean, there's a whole variety. I want to unpack the term, right? That's always my go-to inclination, is like, I want to unpack the term. And that is not a disposition, to introduce yet another word, that plays well in the policy game. There are people who can do it. My hat is off to them. I am not one of them.
Right, so a little desire from Benjamin here as well?
I have a small question. So I grew up thinking that constructivists changed the world. And then I realized that the world changed alongside them, and that the connection may have been more spurious than what I first thought. But my question, playing on Jason here, is, can IR scholars change the world?
Should they?
Yeah. That wasn't my question.
No, I think I already said no.
Kristin, did you have?
Yes, if we're doing some responses to the questions asked, I just want to say this about, because I agree with you. I think this has become, a question that very much affects us in the sense that, this territory is becoming all of a sudden something that is really, on our minds. And I guess the constructivist answer, to me at least, it would be, it's what we make of it, right? So it's the representation of Greenland all of a sudden as something that is contested, and that it's a story that has all of a sudden taken a turn. And it sets the bandwidth for different types of policy options, which is why it is a real life problem as well, because it could lead to different kinds of policy paths. So I think, that's maybe our task as scholars as well, is to actually recognize and make sense of that which is going on. And I think that's the answer to you as well, because you asked, do policymakers want explanations? Well, I think sometimes they do, but I also think they want the sense making. And I think, sometimes they just want us to open up that mindset for them. And I think that is what we can do in translation, the bilingual aspect, that we can also help put in conversation these immediate policy questions with the theory, with the broader thinking, with the longer lines. And I think maybe, that is our advantage as researcher, and also something that makes us not only sit in the ivory tower and do this, thinking back and forth and all these twists and academic, the novelty of the theory, innovation, etc., but how we can actually contribute while not necessarily telling them what to do, but by setting in conversation these perspectives and open up their mindsets, that different things are possible.
If I may say, territory is a four-syllable word. We should tell you something about, it's a concept on stilts. We can talk about land, and it's something more substantial going on there we can all relate to. We can even talk about terra, the Latin, and realize how many ways we have anchored ourselves in terra firma. But as soon as we, all of us, 200 years ago or so, it took a couple hundred years for the concept of territory to emerge in anything close to its contemporary form. Jens, for example, has written about this. After 200 years, we get a four-syllable word that none of us can trust anymore. It tells you something about about linguistic adequacy, as I mentioned earlier.
Julia?
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to add something to Kristin's comment, because I'm a person who does a lot of, in a way, I would say it's mirroring. It's showing the politicians what stories are told from different places. So I just wanted to add, I think that is really crucial in times where everybody think they are playing a new geopolitical game and are in a way working hard to create their own bubbles of understanding and refusing to come out of them. So that mission to go in and just say, look, these are what the different bubbles look like. I think that is a core job for scholars, constructivist scholars. Thank you.
Politicians listen to you? Because ours don't.
Yes, actually they do.
Cool.
And I don't think we should underestimate. We should not underestimate what politicians are able to understand, and we shouldn't underestimate the loop which goes to speaking to the public, who then can influence their politicians.
Just a very quick point on that, and here I have to reference our positivist colleagues who do studies of the international relations discipline. The TRIPS surveys indicate that the distance between active political scientists and politicians is much, much smaller in Norway than most other countries. So, and the flip side, that Norwegian politicians do appreciate interactions with researchers much, much more than most other similar and dissimilar countries.
Oliver and Rebecca, we'll get to you. We'll add one question from Paul first. And from... Yes. No.
want to weigh in on the conversation so far. I think whether policymakers are receptive to constructivism. I think that they're receptive to it when it's the other side that is being deconstructed, right? So if you talk about the hacking that you cited earlier, like it's very helpful to deconstruct the Russian narratives. That's very welcome. We need to understand their ideologies, which if we get to the bottom of it, are somehow disconnected from reality, right? But I think that there's a tendency to, and that's why it's harder now. I think the politics of the question, we don't have time for geopolitics in this current moment, is partly a reflection of to deconstruct our identity, right? I wrote a paper about NATO's identity over time, and it suddenly became defender of the rules-based order. And I got a question like, yeah, it makes sense, but why now? Why now? Is this helpful? And I think that if there isn't ethics of constructivism, I think it needs to be related to reflecting on what we choose to deconstruct, right? And it speaks back to the point about the norms researchers choosing to follow their politics. That if even if the disposition or sensibility or whatever you want to call it is potentially apolitical, the choice of the question, the choice of what you choose to be difficult about, is always political. And that, I think that matters for thinking about whether we should welcome or where our constructivism is welcome.
Jeanette, please.
Well, so I've been in this profession for some 60 years, and I watched how my professors and my colleagues and my students, and I might even say now my grand students, have framed the problem of relating scholarship to power. And in the course of this time, I've observed changes, and these changes have reflected, I think, more what's gone on in the political world than what's gone on in the intellectual world. So one of my early mentors, Hans Morgenthau, very clearly believed that our job was to speak truth to power. And of course now we'd be very careful about using the word truth for all the obvious reasons. And at the same time, we'd be extremely pessimistic, Norway aside, of politicians listening to what we have to say. Alas, in the United States now, there's clearly a move to even keep us from saying what we want to say and intimidating us. In these circumstances, we really have to reframe how we think about our task. And here I'd like to suggest that this problem transcends constructivism. I mean, it's really true for everybody in our profession, regardless of their particular paradigm or methodological or epistemological slant. So in this regard, it would be very helpful to have a dialogue with these other people, because as the Western environment becomes less friendly to scholarship, open inquiry, and dialogue, it becomes more important for us to keep it alive, and our would-be intellectual adversaries are very much more disposed, if they think about their interest, to become our allies in this task. And it would be very interesting to know how my colleagues on the Roundtable think we might go about trying to do something like this.
Excellent. Rebecca? Do you want to start?
There was a piece, I think it was Paul Musgrave, who wrote about the lab leak, like this idea that IR has invented so many bad ideas, and most of them have had terrible effects, like the chessboard, the billiard ball. I mean, these things actually these metaphors go out and have real life implications, and mostly for the worse. And maybe even now that we are looking back at the liberal progressive movement, it wasn't as progressive as some people thought. And I don't know if that's the most important impact. I think the way in which constructivists or whatever sensibilities, actually here I'm with you, I think the most important thing going forward is to protect the academic freedom. And it's such a fundamental issue. So it doesn't really matter if you're a positivist or if you're not. So unite all university people and students, because there's something to be fought for that's much bigger than those divisions. And you're right about that those divisions could impede, could actually be the main obstacle. So yeah, I'm
Thank you. Please. If we remember Oliver's talk, he trashed liberalism. I do it myself all the time. But what I'm hearing you say, Ned, is that that's actually dumb to be trashing.
Tempting as it is. Tempting as it is.
Tempting as it is. The issues are bigger now than the difference between constructivists of my sort, constructivists of the other sort, liberals, etc., etc. I will grant that.
Oliver, did you have a response to one of the questions?
Oh, well, okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I would say territory gets a bad reputation. I mean, it might be important. I'm coming from the southwest of Germany, which is occupied territory. And I try to convince some that we're actually living in the humanitarian crisis, and I wonder where Bono is. And I want to free Baden concerts. And nobody believes me that we are actually occupied and suppressed for the last 50 years and we cannot fight for independence. So I'm fully with you about the territory, and I don't mean it in it doesn't. I mean it. Jason, I'm not sure why you're so focused on the origins and political theory, because I mean, first of all, I would say some of the origins are also from other areas. I mean, we have biology, physics, but also economists. I mean, you hear of market privatization, publics, new public management. I mean, it's all coming from, I'm not sure would they reduce that to political theory. So, yes, I mean, we can wonder about origins, but wouldn't it also be interesting to look at the consequences, the social performative consequences, when these ideas are invoked, in what name and for what purpose? And so you have all that, and then you can say, well, so I wouldn't say, I'm not striving for origin, because what does it tell you? So not very much, but the consequences and the hierarchies and the inclusion, that I would find interesting. We're talking, I mean, what I try to get my head around some of the talks that we're having here, because Wissenschaftspolitik, I mean, collective singulars always make me itchy. I don't know. I mean, as if there's one thing that's science, Wissenschaft, which also then begs the question, what's not? You know? I mean, rather than wondering, there are various ways of doing science. I mean, we have all these humanities, social sciences, natural science, and that's something we talked about. Now we talk about science, and there's politics, and now we talk about, and we wonder and are surprised to realize, oh, well, there are political moments in science, and there may be scientific moments in politics, but is that really the important question now? Wonder. Also, with the reception or not, I mean, whether or not we're able to influence policymakers. I mean, it sounds like an Amazon model. Oh, there's a parcel. Take it or leave it. You know? And it rings the bell, and sometimes they open the door, and sometimes they don't. I mean, what kind of communication model is that? That we have some kind of knowledge that we convey, and then they take it. And of course, I mean, once they take it, I mean, it will become something completely different, and maybe we don't want to be associated with that in the first place, because, I mean, whatever happens. So I'm not sure to what extent it gets us that very far, but I would certainly agree, and I would keep the distance to some extent, because, I mean, some other scientists, like economists and lawyers, are very good having these close connections and actually be in that circles. And we may want to understand how these circles actually work. Who sits in these panels? Who defines these monetary policies? And who, I mean, there are so many loops. I mean, and we know in law, Kessler, wasn't it? He was a judge, an expert, and a lawyer at the same time, and he moved in circles and therefore got state's responsibility on the market. I mean, you wouldn't have that kind of circular relationship within international relations because we don't have judges and we don't rule in the same way. So there are institutional infrastructures within the sciences that allow you to have an impact if you want to in a very different way. But do we really want to?
Since
I don't know,
Kissinger and Huntington are the two names that would come to mind. You want to talk about IR people that changed the world?
We're approaching the end. We have 3 or 4 minutes left. Two extremely quick questions from Nikos and Juha.
Thank you very much for this very interesting roundtable. And you touched upon so many issues. But, well, first of all, authoritarian regimes have always targeted historically academics, so we must be doing something right if we're getting killed for it. And secondly, this is more of a question for Rebecca, but Oliver, you just said something that is very intriguing, that how can we sort of try to find ways to bridge the gap between academia and politics, and you said, why should we do that? We don't have to do that, unless I misunderstood what you're saying. Okay, because we don't have to. We are two separate entities, and we should continue to be separate entities, because as Rebecca in her book that I very much wait to read, to be honest, essentially argues the existence of a problem that is now central to the European Union, the bubble. Okay, when you have problems all around the EU, and you struggle to gain the attention of the Brussels system, okay, to focus on things that matter to the continent, okay, that we have problems in France, problems in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, okay, in the Netherlands, well, not in the Netherlands so much, but you have the Brussels bureaucracy, talking about how we're going to revolutionize the carbon footprint of Europe, or how we're going to make all cars electric by 2030, as if the average European could actually afford an electric car. My question is, essentially, we are now discussing, okay, that how potentially we could bridge the gap between policy and academia. Politicians do not do the same. And politicians, as Patrick said, whenever they got involved in politics, they made a terrible job at it. Okay, academics becoming politicians. So why? Why do we have to do that? We make an effort to make our concepts, our assumptions, our empirical work accessible. Okay, it's their responsibility if they want to read it. We don't have to bring it closer to them. There's really nothing to be gained from that. Okay, in my mind that was framed as a question. Apparently it didn't come up.
You have a literal question. So in the early parts there was the notion of imaginary. So we discussed that clearly academics are not giving this imaginary of current geopolitics, but there is this imaginary that geopolitics is back. Right. So where does this imaginary come from? Where do the politicians get it, and the media? Looking at you.
Would like to have a final word, Rebecca?
Well, I cannot talk about all the imaginaries, but the imaginaries that I'm fascinated by are not produced so much by IR scholars for the moment, but among the tech moguls and the kind of science fiction, pop culture games that have ideas about, us immigrating, or a little portion of the population immigrating, leaving the rest of the population here on Earth, and going to colonize Mars, or that's going to be great. But that's a real imaginary, just as real as the fantasy about Greenland and the
or the fantasy about the self-regulating market.
Yeah.
Like
or the fantasy of the IR
of the IR scholar who, yeah, exactly,
who just rules the world.
Self-driving cars. Dewey once, and Jason left the room unfortunately, so he's not going to hear me make my big, like, this is the thing I really like. One of the point I really like about Dewey. Now, Dewey at one point, if I slow this down, then Jason will come back in the room, and you will hear me give the praise to Dewey. Okay, you just wait for you to get back. At one point, and he repeats this because Dewey has a tendency to repeat himself, Dewey argued that the most important intellectual work calling attention to problems and promulgating solutions is not done by experts. It's done by artists. And it's done by artists because artists are able to speak directly and emotionally in ways that are scientific, whatever that means, discourses within the academy tend not to push the same kinds of buttons. In terms of the current crazy fantasies, and there's a paper on this tomorrow, actually, the sci-fi stuff is really important for what it is that these folks are reading and where they're getting these particular ideas about colonization and artificial intelligence, which isn't artificial intelligence. Everything they're called AI now is actually just a large language model. It's not generalized AI. And there's no opportunity to have generalized AI with the path that they're on, and even the experts admit they're not going to get generalized AI out of this. They're going to get better and better simulations. Okay, great, useful for certain things, not for others, but it's not going to be freaking R2-D2, right? You're not going to get to that point that it's an autonomous person. It's the popular artists, and they're not always great artists. That was the sort of 19th century conceit that it's like the great artists who do these things. No, it's the popular ones. It's the ones people read. It's the ones who write the trashy television shows that, unfortunately, so often we academics like to turn our nose up at the trashy television shows. But how many people watch those shows? How many people learn the kind of sensibility that's encoded, the folk theory that's encoded into those shows, right? How many people learned about security problems from watching 24? Right, and learn that terrorism required extreme measures, including the taking away rights and extreme interrogation, and when time pressure is important, that's what they need to do. They cited it on the floor of the U.S. Senate, right? Like, there are people who really bought those notions. We don't do that, but we can study that. And maybe if we study that, we can learn a little bit more about how it works, and maybe someone who is actually an artist can maybe produce something a little bit better. If I could do that, I would, but I'm not that kind of artist.
We're a bit on overtime. Oliver, I think we have to leave the 10 seconds. Say 10 seconds.
10 seconds. Just one of the key concepts that arises in that semantic field is geoeconomics, actually, which is an economics discourse. And what geoeconomics does, apart from redefining the spatio-temporal configuration, actually, it points us, I think, to one problem, that we are entering a world of de-differentiation, because we learned that the vocabulary of security is different from the vocabulary of the economy. Now we see that they are overlapping, and that mixes up a lot. And this is something that we, as constructivists, actually can try to understand.
And on that note, a huge round of applause for the panel. Any practicalities we should?
Any practicalities about dinner and stuff like that?
So, dinner will